Hello and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I am, of course, your host, Louka. Thanks for being with us. And today, it's my delight to be speaking with Dr. Anantha Duraiappah. Anantha is the inaugural director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, known as MGIEP. It was the first UNESCO Category 1 Institute of Education in the Asia Pacific, and it has a strong focus on social emotional learning and digital pedagogy, all in service of a kinder, healthier, and more just world for all. Anantha is an experienced environmental development economist, although he might say a confused economist now. He's received his PhD in economics from the University of Texas and has authored numerous books and journal articles, and for some decades now has been a system leader, working at a global level, trying to shift consciousness and practice around education and the environment. Anantha, thank you for joining the Learning Future podcast.
Happy to be here.
It's great to have you. It's great to be connecting with you once again. These are strange times. They're remarkable times. Just before our recording, we were talking about this. But what is something that you've been learning recently?
It's an interesting question. You introduced me as an economist and as a confused economist. And I think it leads very much to what I'm starting to realize is that the foundations that we were taught on when we were doing especially with the doctoral studies and stuff, is the whole notion of rationality and how humans are modeled as rational human beings. Now, it was interesting that then that there was this whole surge of behavioral economics, Daniel Kahneman and others, who kind of said that, irrational was, and then the notion of irrationality. But what has really fascinated me recently is the role of emotions, which we tend to sort of take it for granted, but really not giving it the kind of due recognition in terms of how it influences our lives day to day, seconds to seconds, in fact, microseconds. And then on introspection, I find how many of my decisions have been so driven by emotions. And when you say that if a decision is being made with emotions, then it's irrational, I don't think so. I think rational decision-making has to account for emotions in that whole process. And that to say that we are irrational because we have emotions in that it played a role, I think does injustice to the kind of beings we are. We are social beings, and therefore emotion plays such a big role. Now, so that's the thing that I've learned is that is rationality is the interlinked interconnectedness of cognition and emotions working in symbiosis. Now, the challenge is when the emotions then, as Paul Ackerman had alluded in terms of the various emotions and stuff. So when you make a decision, when you're really angry, now, is that the decision that you would have made if you were in a different state of mind and where you are able to regulate those emotions? And that's where we're getting into in terms of how our education systems will need to start to change to account for this role of emotions and training our brains in terms of for the emotions. We train our brains for maths and literacy. Why not train our brains for emotions? I'm always surprised when they say, "Oh, you're manipulating with the brain. You're trying to." And it's like, don't you do that when you teach maths and history and stuff? The minute you learn, that's what's happening. Your neural networks are getting rewired or created. So I think the thing that I've learned is that it's not right to say that if one makes a decision with emotions that is irrational. I think it's within the rational decision making from that person's perspective. Yeah. It's rational to me. It might not be rational to you, but it's rational to me. And I'm the rational decision maker. So that's how. So I think it's how do we now incorporate emotions into that decision-making framework?
That's fantastic, Anantha. And I mean, I think it links beautifully to the work that you're exploring there at UNESCO MGIEP, the urgent need for social emotional learning. What role does that play in terms of identifying and navigating emotions, mindful engagement, human flourishing? And your piece around, somehow we're not trying to become machines. This kind of tyranny, as my colleague would say, Dr. Jean Clinton, the tyranny of cognitive obsession is such that we've forgotten about the other dimensions that truly make us human beings. So take us into that world a little bit. Why do we need to rethink learning? What is the role that education systems can play far more powerfully in helping every human being understand their emotions and make powerful decisions with them, as opposed to, despite them, perhaps?
Yeah. I think so. You got two things there. One is the whole notion of learning, and then we have the more formal system, which is the education. I call that as an institution, and a formal institution that has been created to foster learning, rather than maybe in the past that it was done through experience, through dialogues. But here we have kind of systematized it. And I kind of see, I've always kind of looked at, how learning and how it has evolved. And I looked at the early days, and I think this is across. I kind of like to stay away from the Western discourse and the Eastern discourse. It was never so disconnected. It was always, there was lots of interplay. And if you see, during Aristotle's time and during the times of Confucius and stuff, there was always a lot of focus on dialogue. And it's about asking the bigger questions in life. And yes, maths and stuff was important, but they had dialogues about it. Even if you're looking at mathematical principles, axioms, the Pythagoras, very active dialogue and stuff. The only problem was that it was only among the elites. So it was not a very just, equitable system in terms of giving it to the masses, where everybody could get into that kind of process. Then we started the industrial era, and so we sort of said, okay, let's give education to the masses, but I think with the wrong purpose, with the wrong goal. And the goal here is what we are now struggling with, is to create efficient, productive cogs in a economic system, where the focus is on productivity. And so let's give the masses this knowledge about exploring very fundamental questions on beings and what it means to be happy. Is it possible to actually ever achieve a state of constant happiness? What does that mean? Why are we here? What is our existence? What is our existence with other living beings? I was so happy to hear recently in Spain that they have now passing a law where they recognize dogs as also sentient beings and giving them the kind of, I would say, citizenship in terms of it's part of the family and stuff. And when you relate with them, I think they've been really snotty little species. When we say we are the most intelligent and we are the only ones with emotions, I think it's been extremely discourteous to the others. So now we are now at the point where now we can go back to. So we got where we had the stuff, but it was only for the elite, and the rest didn't have it. Then we brought it all to the masses, but we forgot about the whole dialogic process. Now I think we have the opportunity to have that kind of a rich discussions of fundamental issues, fundamental questions. Of course, numeracy, literacy will be all part of that because you need to have that, but also understanding the whole notion of emotions, meditation, mindfulness, because those were all very essential parts of old traditional education systems. But in the of getting achieve productivity, we have forgotten that. But again, I want to also be a bit cautious that there have been some forces, and I say naughty forces,
Right.
that have now trying to use mindfulness as a way to increase that productivity. Because again, it's the mindset of, so, I put my economist hat right now, and you sort of say, we use these production functions. And we talk about labor and capital, and then as you put more capital and labor, you move along that production function. And now we have reached some diminishing returns. Now we say, you know what, we will have socio-emotional, and then we will have that production function jump up rather than moving along it. You have a monotonic jump. And then, my God, with the same capital and labor, we get a huge increase. Wrong. I don't think that's the goal we should be looking at. I think that will automatically come. I call that as a positive externality. The goal should be for human flourishing. And this is why, 2 years ago, maybe in fact, the whole idea started off about 3 years ago. As you had, when you introduced me, I've been working primarily on the interface between nature and economics, which brought into human development. And in that community, we had always been cognizant of the need for multidisciplinary, huge collective voices of experts and scientists working on the interface. And we have had these things called global assessments. The one that you most probably will, most of your readers would or listeners would recognize would be the IPCC,
yes,
the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is this huge body of experts who come every 3-4 years, and then they bring in all the literature, what the knowledge is, what has been published, so that the scientific quality and rigor is there to say, what do we know? What do we agree on? Or where do we have confidence of? Like 90%, we have now 90 to 95% confidence that we are into a 2-degree world. That was not there 30 years ago, but with this continuous, and then we had the same for biodiversity, which is more where I spent a lot of later years working on the interface between biodiversity, nature, and human flourishing, or well-being, as we used to say. So when I came into the field of education, I was a little bit surprised at the lack of these type of assessments. And when you talk about assessments in the education field, immediately they talk about PISA, student learning exams, as you call it. I don't call those assessments, it's just exams. So I detest exams, and I'll tell you a little bit about exams. They should be just taken and put into a dish, those carburetors, and then just switch on the machine and just throw it off. It's garbage. But so we decided to have to do something like that within the education community. And so we started this something called the IC, which is the International Science and Evidence Education Assessment. Now, it's been a fantastic experience of over 2.5 years or so. COVID, unfortunately, prevented us from actually getting together and sitting around the table for usually we do this for a week, a very intensive 10 hours a day kind of thing. We lock ourselves in a hotel, and that's all we do. We just write, go back, discuss, come back, revise, add, and stuff. We were not able to do that, but we did the second best with online and stuff. So that's going to be published and launched in March of 2022. It's turned out to be a humongous project. We had about 260 over experts from across more than 45 countries. It was extensively peer reviewed. So we went through the whole peer reviewing process, 2 reviewers, sometimes one, then some of the others stepped in. And then they had to comment on those to make sure that, and then we had review editors to make sure that this whole process was done. That's very important, I think, the rigor, because now, especially with this pandemic, it has shown us that science Science is important, but we also have to make sure that the science has a rigor and has the collective voice of the scientific community rather than one or two voices here and there saying certain things. Those are important, but we need to have that collective voice. And it doesn't have to always say we agree, but it is important to understand where the disagreements are and what kind of confidence that people are saying certain things. And so we're going to launch this. It's turned out to be a 900-page report in 4 volumes, but we will have a summary for decision makers. And we did a teaser event at the General Conference of UNESCO in November, where we sort of had some of the headliners. And I think people liked it, some of the headliners. We weren't talking to what people would like to hear, that we have done well, but we need to strengthen. No, we haven't done well. And we need to revise it, and we need to really drastically think about what our goals are. Because I say, if we achieve education as it is right now, we might be in more trouble than before. Because the predatory mindset of our education systems today will create more predators than nurturers. And so we have to completely change that goal. The goal is very important.
That's very interesting. I'm excited to have a look at the summary for decision makers when that comes available, Anantha. And take us into this goal of education, because if you're a teacher or a school principal or a parent listening to our conversation today, sometimes this can just seem so overwhelming, but your point, as I understand it, is if we obsess about this idea of productivity, or let's even call it output, it's based within this mechanistic paradigm, which is you're an economic unit and you're here to create productivity and to consume. And we're missing the human in this. And as the kind of truism, the emerging truism goes, what we want is first-class human beings, not second-class robots. So we need to think, what is it that makes us uniquely human? And how do we flourish and thrive within that? So what have you seen across all the work that you do in intergovernmental and international levels, when you see a system really take seriously the path of shifting the goal of education? Because in many countries like Australia, we have a beautifully articulated goal for education, the Alice Springs Declaration, the Bantuer Declaration, and it's fantastic. It's about creative and confident citizens that are, thriving and flourishing. And yet there's a disconnect between the stated goal and then how it manifests within the education system. So how do we close that distance, between goal and system, or certainly goal and single school that might be, working hard but still stuck within a particular paradigm?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question, in the sense that we have all the declarations, we have all the resolutions. If you looked at the Delos report of UNESCO, the Faure report, and then now the latest Futures of Education report, we have these lofty goals, a humanistic approach to education, social justice, and so forth. And in the assessment that we have just talked about, there was a working group that focused on the whole notion of human flourishing. And what does that mean? Because when you say flourishing, okay, what does that mean in terms of real? And so I was very happy to see the co-chairs of that working group really push the authors to sort of not to put in, to draw from all the different disciplines, because you have the philosophers who are kind of really tend to be the custodians of this whole discussion. But then but I think there was a lot of input from the neurosciences. Now, this was really interesting, in a sense that flourishing could be, in a sense, it can be trained. So that was something new for somebody who has worked on flourishing for some time, been looking at the work of Amartya Sen, some of the other philosophers, John Rawls, and so forth and so on. Here comes a neuroscientist and says flourishing can be trained. It's like, what? and totally skeptical. But then that's the beauty of this dialogue, is that it makes a point in terms of how you can rewire the neural networks such that the flourishing happens, and that's training. So they go back to the training of the brain and creating neural networks that will spark those parts of the brain, create those neurotransmitters, the oxytocins, the dopamines, and all that stuff, which makes us feel safe, makes us happy. Basically, it's kind of, a lot of people will take back when you say we are just walking masses of chemical interactions and electrical signals and fields.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating piece of tissue that we carry in our head, isn't it? When you go into neuroscience, as a dumb economist, started looking at it, I was like, whoa, synapses, dendrils, how they connect with each other, and then the electric spark, and then you get the chemicals, and then you feel good, and you feel, and so I think it's so important that this multidisciplinary approach is taken for our education systems, where you can get these insights into this. So I go ranting. I'm sorry. Let me come back to it. So the whole notion of flourishing.
Yeah.
And I think it's about potentiality. And I like that term because they use the word potential. And then kind of as a well-trained economist, as an opportunist, I looked at it and they said, hey, this is a concept that's worth pushing forward, is the notion of potentiality. Now, I contrast this to the standard systems that we have now, which is meritocracy. And there's a brilliant book by Daniel Markovits. I think it was now 2020 or 2020. I think it was 2020 publication, The Meritocracy Trap.
Yeah. And
he basically sort of says how that whole thing, that concept, which was, the whole idea of a social equalizer, the equity equalizer, has actually become one of the biggest divergence, in a sense that the whole system has been hijacked. And he's not sort of saying that, the people who have hijacked are, he calls it the new aristocracies, the new aristocrats. But rather than the old aristocrats who lived off the capital of others or the labor of others, they still have to live off their own, but they abuse the capital of others as well. And therefore you see this huge inequality divide that is growing in this world, the top 1% owning 54% of the global wealth and so forth, is because they have captured the education system. And how he shows that the Ivy League, basically more than 70% of the population, the students of Ivy League, come from the top 5% families and stuff of the world.
Right.
So I think if I remember correctly, is 1 in every 200 student is the one who comes from the middle class or rises up and stuff like that. So but he warns that they don't get in just by paying and getting in there. These are smart people as well. They are smart, and I like Dan, in a sense. He says, "I'm a product of that." And he says, "When I was at school, I saw a lot more smarter students, but they didn't have the kind of parents and so forth, that kind of environment." So I've never liked having these exams that we have as a way to see how well you're doing. I remember from my school days. And my mom was a teacher. And when I come back very happy and I said, hey, I got 80%, I've improved. The last time it was 65, now I got 80%. And the first response is, who was the highest? What? I was like, well, yeah, it's him, the same chap again, he's got 95%. And she says, well, your 80% is not good enough. He's 95. And I was like, well, when is this ever going to stop? So what about, I define potentiality as a good way of looking at the delta changes. Like if somebody is constantly improving, and this is what I always say, be your own benchmark. The system should encourage this concept of be your own benchmark.
That's
which
great.
means I'm here, I have improving, and I'm improving. And of course, we always maintain the bare essentials that you need in terms of numeracy, literacy. We have all that information to say what you need to have achieved by this particular stage in your life. Or, in fact, now they say that learning is non-linear. You shouldn't have these linear processes, and there might be different ways. You might learn, and each one of us is different.
Yeah.
I might be more inclined towards maths than in language. And so I have to accommodate. But don't keep me back in grade 3 in maths when I'm already can go to grade 5 if in the present system. But my language is much, much, much more difficult. So, so you have this very flexible, adaptive system that allows feedbacks and stuff. We are able to do that now with technology. And this is why MGIEP focuses so much on digital pedagogy. And we made a decision very early on to develop our own learning platform, which will provide this. I didn't want to go to the Google schools and Microsoft for a number of reasons. One, it was too linear and it was focused on the same systems that we have right now, but just going digital. We wanted something really digital. That's why we use the term pedagogy. It's a digital pedagogy rather than ICT. Very different.
Great point.
Really great. Because it's a whole pedagogy by itself, and the whole thing about adaptive feedback, making mistakes is no problem, because you make a mistake immediately you get a feedback. With technology, you can get, and this is where I tend to support AI in many ways, artificial intelligence, because we can do that.
Yeah.
Of course, making sure that we put in systems to protect the child.
Yeah.
That's very important. The privacy is so important. That's why the advances by the EU with this GDPR and stuff is very, very good. We have to make sure. But let's take advantage of these techniques as well. So the whole notion of potentiality, and then the other important thing that came out of this, and it alludes to my first talk about rationality with emotions, is that learning is not just cognition. It is also emotions as well. And so learning is influenced by emotions, and emotions influence learning as well. And our decision making, the way that we see the world, is a combination of, and this they have already said, so we use the term a whole brain approach, which means the education systems have to integrate the cognitive dimensions as well as the social and emotional dimension integrated. So you don't have a class on social emotional. You just don't go and say, okay, we'll start off with 5 minutes of meditation and then that's it. And then we go on and start. No, it's integrated within the whole school, it's integrated within the whole the time that you spend there. And after a while, it becomes part of your DNA, isn't it?
Well, we have, again, another new field of research, but epigenetic research, of course, that's showing the influences of lifestyle on how our genes express. And that opens up a whole other... I mean, it's amazing thinking about reflecting on your thoughts on neuroscience, for example, Anantha. I mean, this was not a science 3 decades ago, really, of any significant impact. Now we're talking about neurobiology, or we're talking about the effective neurosciences. I mean, there's so much amazing work that's taking place here. And I love your reflections on potentiality as what must be at the heart of all human development and human societies, perhaps. And this idea, be your own benchmark, that really... I want to ask you a question here, because be your own benchmark, I mean, from my vantage point, it seems like we are seeing these trends away from standardization to personalization, but that personalization can still be held within a system that is largely competitive as opposed to being truly personal or even subjective. What do you see from the work you're doing and the amazing experiences, the different pieces of work you've led internationally, what the emerging future of education could become? If we're having this conversation in 2037, in 15 years' time, if we've been successful, what might schools and education systems be doing?
Um, wow, that's a loaded question. It's like a crystal ball.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Uh, I see a vision like where we are kind of transiting from the physical to the metaverse. I want to bring in the metaverse.
Great. I'm glad you did.
In a sense, that's becoming, and it's not something that was basically new by Facebook, Zuckerberg, and others. Science fiction authors have already been talking about this for a long time, the Matrix and so forth. And if you're in digital games, and then if you're using virtual reality, you're already there in many ways. Now, and I remember, I always think of this term that Deepak Chopra had in one of his books called Synchrodestiny.
Yeah.
And I remember, if you go onto our website, we have a video which we produced nearly 3 years or 4 years ago. And it tells about two students in a class, and then the teacher comes and gives the grades, your standard thing, and then the student looks and she sees a C, and then you see this whole fall in the expression, and then a friend beside her looks at it, and then he puts a smiley face around the C, and turns the C into a smiley face, and then he makes it into a little arrow, and then he throws the arrow, and then we start this journey, and it's a journey of where we bring in there's maths, there's the Fibonacci spiral, and the golden ratio, but also empathy, compassion was also part of the building blocks, and then it goes around the world. The paper plane goes around the world, so it's spreading across the world. And then it comes back to the class, and the class has been transformed, where they have these 3D glasses, and they are connecting in this metaverse, and they're doing all this new the maths with the Fibonacci ratio. It's there, and it was called C. And I was like, my God, we didn't think about the metaverse 3 years ago. This was just like, this is what we shot. I was always influenced by Ender's Game,
Yes.
the movie and stuff, and where they learn through although unfortunately they used the kids in a bad way and destroyed a civilization, thinking that it was a game. But so it's I think the new is where we are transiting from the metaverse to the physical world. I think it's important that we just don't live in this metaverse and that's it. It's not healthy. That's not what we as human beings are, as beings and living beings. But how do we have, because the potentiality of with digital is huge, but it could also become extremely negative.
Yeah.
And this is why we call for an education system where social-emotional learning is a foundational, and I think compassion is a competency that needs to be trained. And when you have empathy and compassion as a competency, just like numeracy and literacy,
Yes,
I think we will have hope for the future. So this is the question. Will kind brains automatically produce a peaceful and sustainable world? My hypothesis is that it is, and the axioms are there to show that it will, using neurosciences, the research coming out from the neurosciences. I loved V.C. Ramachandran's TED Talk, and where he, the famous neuroscientist on the phantom limbs.
Yes.
And he coined the empathy neurons as the Gandhi neurons. And the institute picked that up very quickly because we have the name Gandhi as of the institute, and say what we want to do is build Gandhi neural networks, which he took a whole lifetime of experience, experimentation, and stuff, is to how do you build those kind of neural networks where there's so compassion, not to see, and even going beyond Gandhi and sort of saying, we don't see any differences between people, but we are just all of the same.
Anantha, I love this. Gosh, you said some wonderful things just then. A hypothesis: will kind brains create a peaceful world? And as you say, the axioms are there, and I think we're seeing the evidence play out. But compassion as a competency, as important, if not more important, than the foundation skills of literacy and numeracy. This idea of synchrodestiny, so interesting. And I think, as you say, and the reason I'm really quite taken that MGIEP has gone for this digital pedagogy, because one of the things that we know we can train for really powerfully with technology is things like empathy. When you're in an immersive environment, you're quite quickly able to transcend the ego and have a truly transformative experience somewhere. And that actually can enable us to connect. And of course, there's also huge danger that it can be misused for a whole range of other things. But gosh, some of the takeaways for me from this conversation, be your own benchmark, potentiality as being, really the core feature that we should position as the goal of education as human flourishing. So I'd love for you to just, if it's at all possible, give us some take-home messages for the listeners today. What is it you want to leave us with, pondering on, perhaps, jumping into dialogic process on in future as well?
The take-home is, let's all try to be kind to ourselves and to all other living beings. Practice. And it's so difficult. Every morning I finish off the practice and say, be kind. And I always say, okay, today I'm going to interact with so-and-so, be kind. And then when I reflect the next morning, I said, oh God, I forgot. And it was like, back to the kind of critic and stuff. And so continuously practice because competency is an action. It's not an intellectual process. It's not cognition in sort of reading and knowing about you have to practice, which means the networks will get rewired, that it becomes what Kahneman talks about, system one thinking. The immediate thing is to be kind. That's my immediate. Not immediate is to be to fight or the 3 F's of the first reaction, but to change it to be not the 3 F's, but the kind. Kind to yourself, kind to others, and kind to nature.
That's fantastic.
I call it the K cubed.
The K cubed. I love it. Well, thank you for your kindness today and for your generosity as well, Anantha, in having a conversation with us here at the Learning Future. We've been big fans of your work there at MGIEP, and it's just wonderful to see the changes that you're continuing to make. And so look forward to the release of some of those really big reports as well, and the Futures of Education report, of course, that came out earlier, more late last year, I should say. It's a delight to connect with you and try to create a kinder world, kinder brains, and then maybe, just maybe, a kinder society for all.
Thank you, Louka. I really had fun this morning. And then I'm going to try to see if I'm going to be able to practice what I said this morning.
This is the coherence piece, isn't it, for all of us? Yeah.
If I get 50%, I'm happy. Remember, I've been trained as an economist.
Well, a recovering economist, I think, as you would say. But no, it's a delight always to connect with you, Anantha, and I'm sure there'll be many more opportunities as we keep doing the work we do. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Take care. Bye,
you as well.